The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded beast through the valley, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. Thomas McGraw pulled his collar higher against the biting cold as he surveyed his land from atop the ridge. Below him stretched 500 acres of grassland, now brown and brittle with frost, where his horses and cattle huddled together for warmth. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of copper and blood, reminding him that another day had passed in solitude. At 36, Thomas had built this ranch with his own hands. Every fence post driven deep into the unforgiving earth, every stable beam cut and fitted through sweat and determination. The Double M Ranch, named after his late father, Matthew McGraw, stood as a testament to what a man could accomplish alone. But lately, that word alone had begun to weigh on him like a stone in his chest. He guided his mare, Duchess, down the rocky path toward the main house. The two-story structure looked sturdy enough from the outside, its log walls chinked tight against the weather. Inside, however, it felt as empty as a church on Monday. The windows glowed faintly in the dying light, but Thomas knew no one waited behind them. No warm meal on the stove, no gentle voice to greet him, no soft laughter to fill the hollow spaces between the walls. "Come on, girl," he murmured to Duchess, patting her neck. "Let's get you settled for the night." The barn welcomed them with its familiar sense of hay, leather, and horse. Thomas worked methodically, removing Duchess's saddle and brushing her coat until it gleamed. These routines kept him grounded, gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together in an endless stream of work and silence. He'd learned long ago that keeping busy was the best defense against the thoughts that crept in during quiet moments. As he hung the bridle on its peg, old Sam Winters shuffled in from the back stalls. The grizzled ranch hand had been with the Double M for near 8 years now, his loyalty as dependable as sunrise. "Evening, boss," Sam said, his weathered face creasing into a gap-toothed grin. "Got all the cattle moved to the south pasture like you asked. That broken fence by the creek is mended too." "Good work, Sam." Thomas reached for the coffee pot that always sat warming on the small stove in the corner. The brew was thick as mud and twice as bitter, but it was hot. "You heading to town tonight?" Sam nodded, already gathering his things. "Promised my nephew I'd help him with his new claim. Boy thinks he's gonna strike gold." He snorted. "More likely to strike rock, but youth don't listen to sense." Thomas watched the older man prepare to leave, feeling an unexpected pang of envy. Sam had family, connections, reasons to venture into town beyond buying supplies. When was the last time Thomas had ridden to Willow Creek for anything other than business? "Say, boss?" Sam paused at the door, studying Thomas with eyes that had seen too many Wyoming winters. "You know, Martha Henderson's hosting another one of them social dances Saturday next. Might do you good to—" "I've got that mare coming in from Denver," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Need to be here when she arrives." Sam's expression said he wasn't fooled, but he knew better than to push. "Sure thing, boss. See you come morning." The barn fell silent save for the soft nickering of horses and the wind rattling the rafters. Thomas finished his coffee in slow sips, delaying the inevitable return to the empty house. Outside, the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, each one a cold point of light in the vast wilderness above. The walk to the house took only minutes, but Thomas made it last. He checked the chicken coop. Though he'd already collected eggs that morning, he inspected the water pump, testing the handle though it worked fine. He even stopped to examine the wood pile, calculating how many cords he'd need to survive the coming winter. Anything to postpone stepping through that front door. When he finally did, the silence hit him like a physical force. His boots echoed on the wooden floors as he moved through the rooms, lighting lamps against the encroaching darkness. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, dominated by a stone fireplace he'd built himself. The furniture was practical, sturdy a man's furniture, chosen for function over comfort. No curtains softened the windows. No rugs warmed the floors. No flowers brightened the tables. Thomas built a fire, the crackling flames providing both warmth and companionship. He heated a pot of stew left over from yesterday, ate it standing at the counter, then washed his single bowl and spoon with the mechanical precision of long practice. The evening stretched before him, empty as a dry riverbed. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed to pull off his boots. The bed itself was large, built to accommodate his tall frame, but only one side showed signs of use. The other half remained smooth, the pillow plump and untouched. On the coldest nights, when the wind found every gap in the walls and the fire couldn't chase away the chill, that empty space seemed to radiate cold. Thomas had tried keeping extra blankets there, had even bought a thick buffalo hide to lay across the unused portion. Nothing helped. The cold he felt came from inside, from the absence of another heartbeat in the darkness, another breath in the quiet hours before dawn. He'd been 24 when he'd started building this ranch, full of dreams and determination. The plan had always included a family, a wife who'd make the house a home, children who'd fill it with noise and life. But the years had slipped by like water through his fingers. First, he'd been too busy establishing the ranch. Then came the harsh winter of '81 that killed half his herd. After that, the conflict with the Sullivan brothers over water rights that took 2 years to resolve. Always something. Always a reason to wait. Now, at 36, Thomas found himself successful by any measure that mattered in Wyoming territory. The Double M Ranch was profitable, respected, secure. He had money in the bank, credit at every store in Willow Creek, and the grudging admiration of his fellow ranchers. What he didn't have was someone to share it with. The town offered few prospects for a man like him. The respectable women were all married or too young, barely out of their fathers' homes. The saloon girls were friendly enough for the right price, but Thomas had never been comfortable with such arrangements. He wanted something real, something lasting. He wanted what his parents had shared before fever took them both in the spring of '78. Lying back against his pillow, Thomas stared at the ceiling beams, visible in the flickering firelight from the main room. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, checking fences, moving cattle, breaking horses, maintaining equipment. Good, honest work that he took pride in. But tonight, with the wind moaning through the eaves and his own heartbeat the only sound in the darkness, he admitted what he'd been fighting for months. He was lonely, bone deep, soul-aching lonely. The thought of another winter like the last one, of spending the long, dark months with only Sam and the ranch hands for company, filled him with a dread he couldn't name. He'd survived blizzards, droughts, stampedes, and claim jumpers. But this enemy was different, attacking from within where no amount of strength or stubbornness could defeat it. Thomas rolled onto his side, pulling the blankets higher. Through the window, he could see stars scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. Somewhere out there, beyond his fences and his carefully ordered world, life was happening. People were gathering around dinner tables, sharing their days, planning their tomorrows together. Children were being tucked into bed with kisses and stories. Husbands and wives were settling into each other's arms, finding comfort against the harsh realities of frontier life. "This is enough," he told himself, the same words he'd repeated every night for the past year. "The ranch is enough." But as sleep finally claimed him, Thomas McGraw knew he was lying. The ranch was everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of as a young man. It just wasn't enough anymore. Not when the other side of his bed remained cold. Not when the house echoed with silence. Not when he had no one to share his successes or ease his burdens. The wind picked up outside, sending snow crystals pattering against the windows like fingernails tapping for entry. Winter was coming early this year. The old-timers in town had warned. Thomas had nodded and made his preparations. Same as always. But this time, the thought of those long, dark months ahead filled him with something close to fear. He needed more than warmth on his bed. He needed life in his house, laughter in his rooms, someone to make all this worthwhile. The question was whether a man like him, set in his ways and rough around the edges, could find such a thing in a place as unforgiving as Wyoming Territory, and whether he had the courage to try. As the fire burned low and the cold pressed in from all sides, Thomas McGraw slept fitfully, dreaming of spring and impossible things. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, covering the brown grass in a shroud of white, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and new. Change was coming to the Double M Ranch, though its master didn't know it yet. Sometimes the coldest winters brought the most unexpected thaws. The needles slipped through fabric with practiced ease as Eliza Carter worked by the window of her small cabin on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Morning light filtered through glass she kept spotlessly clean, one of her few indulgences in a life stripped to essentials. At 28, her hands moved with the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on small, careful stitches. The dress she was mending belonged to Mrs. Wellington, the banker's wife. Another tear along the hem, probably from catching it on a carriage step. Rich women could afford to be careless with their clothes, knowing someone like Eliza would always be there to repair the damage. $4 for the job, enough to buy flour, salt, and maybe a bit of bacon if Mr. Henderson was feeling generous at the general store. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with the scent of wild onions and rabbit. She'd snared the rabbit herself yesterday, checking the trap she'd set in the woods behind her property. Nathan had taught her that, along with so many other things. How to read weather and cloud formations, how to stretch a dollar until it screamed, how to remain invisible in a town that preferred its widows to disappear quietly. Eliza paused in her sewing, her fingers unconsciously moving to the simple gold band she still wore. 3 years now since Nathan had ridden out with Sheriff Morrison's posse, chasing after the Colton gang who'd robbed the Wells Fargo office. 3 years since young Timothy Morrison had ridden back alone, hat in hand, to tell her they'd been ambushed at Devil's Canyon. The town had mourned for exactly 1 week. After that, the whispers started. Why had Nathan been the only one killed? Had he been careless, cowardly? Some even suggested he'd been in league with the gang, though anyone who'd known Nathan Carter would have laughed at such nonsense. But grief and gossip were old companions in small towns, and Willow Creek was no exception. Eliza had endured it all with her chin high and her mouth closed. She'd sold their small ranch to pay debts, moved to this cabin on the edge of respectability, and built a life from the skills her mother had taught her before cholera took her family. Sewing, baking, preserving women's work that kept her fed but never quite warm. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Eliza set aside her sewing carefully, smoothing her brown wool dress before answering. Mary Patterson stood on the porch, her round face flushed from the cold walk from town. "Morning, Eliza," Mary said, one of the few who still used her given name instead of the formal white Mrs. Carter that held distance like a fence. "I've brought you some orders from the hotel. 2 tablecloths need mending. And Mrs. DeWitt wants new curtains for the dining room." Eliza accepted the bundle gratefully. Mary ran the laundry at the Willow Creek Hotel and had been kind to her since Nathan's death, passing along work when she could. "Thank you. Mary, would you like some tea? I've got the kettle on." Mary glanced over her shoulder nervously. "I shouldn't—" You know how people talk. But she stepped inside anyway, drawn by warmth and the possibility of friendship. Though I suppose they talk regardless of what we do. That was true enough. Eliza had learned that a widow occupied a peculiar place in the social order, too respectable for the saloon district, too dangerous for the married women's social circles. She existed in a gray space, necessary for her skills but suspect for her independence. "How are things at the hotel?" Eliza asked, pouring tea into 2 cups, her best china that she'd managed to keep from her former life. "Busy as always. That new railroad survey crew's been staying all month." Mary accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Rough bunch, but they pay in cash. She hesitated, then added, "One of them was asking about you yesterday." Eliza's hand stilled. "Oh." "Frank Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, said he remembered you from before, when you and Nathan lived out at the Riverside place." Mary's voice carried a warning. "He's been drinking a lot, talking loud. You might want to be careful." This was another burden of widowhood. Men who saw her status as an invitation, who figured a woman alone must be desperate for any attention. Eliza had dealt with several such approaches over the years, always politely, always firmly, but a drunk railroad worker with family connections could be trouble. "I'll be careful," she assured Mary. "I always am." After Mary left, Eliza returned to her sewing, but her mind wandered. Outside. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising snow by evening. She'd need to bring in more firewood. Check the shutters. Make sure her meager supplies would last if the weather turned bad. These were the calculations that filled her days, small battles against cold and hunger and loneliness. By afternoon, she'd finished Mrs. Wellington's dress and started on the hotel's tablecloths. Her back ached from hunching over her work, but she didn't stop. Idle hands led to idle thoughts, and those were luxuries she couldn't afford. Better to focus on the thread and needle, the simple satisfaction of making something whole again. The bread she'd baked that morning had cooled enough to wrap. Eliza packaged 2 loaves carefully, one for herself, one to sell to whoever might want fresh bread. It was a small income, but every penny mattered when you lived on the margins. She donned her heavy cloak, a remnant from better days that she kept carefully mended, and stepped out into the gathering dusk. The wind had picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the frozen ground. Town was a 20-minute walk down a rutted road that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. Henderson's general store glowed with lamplight, a beacon of commerce in the dying day. Eliza steeled herself before entering. The store was a gathering place for gossip as much as goods. And her presence always caused a subtle shift in conversation. "Mrs. Carter." John Henderson greeted her from behind the counter, his tone professionally neutral. "What can I do for you today?" "I need flour. Mr. Henderson, 5 pounds, if you please. And I have fresh bread if anyone's interested." "I'll take that bread off your hands," a voice said from near the stove. Frank Morrison stepped out of the shadows, his face flushed with whiskey and wind. "Been a while since I had home baking." Eliza kept her expression calm. "That'll be 20 cents, Mr. Morrison." He laughed, a sound without humor. "So formal. Eliza, we practically grew up together. Don't you remember those church picnics? You were sweet on me before Nathan came along." The store had gone quiet. Other customers pretending to examine goods while listening avidly. This was entertainment in a small town. Drama unfolding between the pickle barrels and fabric bolts. "That was a long time ago," Eliza said evenly. "The bread is 20 cents. Frank stepped closer, his breath sour with alcohol. "Everything's business with you now, isn't it?" A man tries to be friendly. "The lady said 20 cents. A new voice interrupted. A tall man emerged from the back of the store, where he'd apparently been examining harnesses. Eliza didn't recognize him, but something about his bearing suggested he wasn't someone to trifle with. Frank's eyes narrowed. "This isn't your concern, stranger." "Maybe not," the man agreed mildly. "But I'd like to buy that bread, and you're holding up the transaction." He moved with easy confidence, positioning himself between Frank and Eliza without seeming to, "Unless you're buying it." For a moment, the tension stretched tight as fence wire. Then Frank cursed under his breath, tossed a quarter on the counter, and grabbed the wrapped loaf. "Keep the change," he sneered at Eliza. "Consider it charity." He stomped out, letting the door bang behind him. "I apologize for the interference," the stranger said, turning to Eliza. "But he seemed to be making you uncomfortable." Now that she could see him properly. Eliza noticed his clothes were well-made but practical, the attire of a successful rancher, not a drifter. His face was weathered but kind, with eyes the color of winter sky. "Thank you," she said simply, "though I can handle Frank Morrison." "I'm sure you can." He touched the brim of his hat. "Thomas McGraw, from the Double M Ranch north of town. And your Mrs. Carter, I've heard you do fine needlework." So, he knew who she was. Everyone did. The widow Carter, who lived alone and took in mending, who'd buried her husband and her reputation in the same week, who baked bread that was said to be the best in the county, though few admitted to buying it. "I do," she confirmed, completing her transaction with Mr. Henderson, who'd watched the entire exchange with the attention of someone storing up details for later telling. Thomas McGraw lingered while she gathered her flour. "Might I walk you home, Mrs. Carter? That storm's coming in fast, and the road can be treacherous in the dark." She wanted to refuse. Accepting would only fuel more gossip, but something in his manner, respectful, careful not to presume, made her nod. "That's kind of you, Mr. McGraw." They walked in companionable silence at first, Eliza carrying her flour while Thomas had apparently purchased supplies of his own. The wind whipped at their clothes, sending the first fat snowflakes swirling around them. "I knew your husband," Thomas said eventually. "Not well, but we did some horse trading a few years back. He seemed a good man." "He was—" Eliza was surprised to find she could say it without the usual tightness in her throat. "He was killed in an ambush. The Colton gang." "I heard. I'm sorry for your loss." They'd reached her cabin, small and neat against the backdrop of dark woods. Eliza hesitated on her porch, good manners warring with propriety. Would you like some coffee before heading back? The storm's getting worse." Thomas looked at the sky, then at the long road back to town and beyond. "That's kind, but I wouldn't want to impose or cause talk." "Mr. McGraw," Eliza said with a wry smile. "They talk about me regardless, at least this way. I get to serve coffee to someone who is decent to me." He smiled back, and she realized he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-30s. "In that case, I'd be grateful for the warmth." Inside, she stoked the fire and put the coffee on, acutely aware of how small her space must seem to someone who owned a large ranch. But Thomas McGraw sat at her modest table without any sign of judgment, his presence filling the cabin in a way that wasn't unwelcome. "You've made a good home here," he observed, noting the neat shelves, the bright quilt on the bed visible through the doorway, the general air of careful maintenance. "It serves its purpose." Eliza poured coffee, rich and black. "Though I imagine it's quite different from what you're used to." "Different isn't always bad." He wrapped his hands around the cup much as Mary had done earlier. Sometimes bigger just means emptier. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a loneliness there, carefully hidden but recognizable to someone who knew the feeling intimately. They drank their coffee while the storm built outside. Speaking of safe things, the coming winter, the price of grain, the new families moving into the valley. When Thomas finally stood to leave, the snow was falling thick and fast. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Carter, and the company." "Thank you for earlier," she replied. "With Frank, it was appreciated." He paused at the door, seeming to wrestle with something. "I wonder. That is, I have some shirts that need mending. Nothing urgent, but if you have time." Eliza recognized the offering for what it was, an excuse for further contact that maintained the fiction of business. "Bring them by whenever convenient, Mr. McGraw. My rates are fair." After he left, Eliza stood at her window watching his tall figure disappear into the swirling snow. For the first time in 3 years, her cabin felt truly empty. She shook her head at such foolishness. She'd learned the hard way that a widow couldn't afford romantic notions. But as she prepared for bed, Eliza found herself humming, something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember. Outside, the storm raged, but inside her small cabin, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope flickered to life. She tried to smother it, knowing how dangerous such feelings could be. But like all fires, once started, it proved difficult to fully extinguish. In town, tongues were already wagging about Thomas McGraw walking the widow Carter home. By morning, the story would have grown in the telling. But for tonight, Eliza Carter allowed herself the small pleasure of remembering what it felt like to be treated with simple kindness, to be seen as more than just the town's tragic figure. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had fresh coffee grounds and the memory of companionable silence to warm her against the cold. The late February sun struggled through gray clouds as Thomas McGraw approached Eliza's cabin, a bundle of shirts tucked under his arm. This had become his routine over the past 2 months, finding excuses to visit, each interaction carefully balanced on the edge of propriety. The shirts didn't really need mending, but he'd pulled loose a button here, worried a seam there, creating reasons to see her. He knocked, noting the freshly repaired shutter and the neat stack of firewood by the door. Last week, he'd mentioned offhandedly that he was splitting extra wood. The next day, a cord had appeared at her cabin, though Eliza had insisted on paying him with fresh bread and preserves. Mr. McGraw," she greeted him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Come in from the cold. I was just starting on your coat from last week." The cabin smelled of cinnamon and yeast, warmth radiating from both the stove and her presence. Thomas had grown to treasure these moments, the quiet domesticity, the careful conversation, the way she moved with unconscious grace around her small domain. "No rush on that coat," he said, setting the shirts on her work table. "Just a few more items when you have time." Eliza examined the shirts with knowing eyes, a small smile playing at her lips. "This button seems to have fallen off in exactly the same place as the last one." Heat crept up Thomas's neck. "Hardware, I suppose." "I suppose." She set the shirts aside, her fingers lingering on the fabric. "Would you like some coffee? I've just made a fresh pot." This too had become routine. The offer, the acceptance, the careful dance of two lonely people afraid to acknowledge what was growing between them. They sat at her small table, the same spot where they'd first shared coffee during that storm 2 months ago. "How's the ranch?" Eliza asked, pouring with steady hands. "Good. Lost a few calves to the cold snap, but nothing we can't handle." Thomas watched her over his cup, noting the way afternoon light caught in her dark hair. "Sam's been asking after you. Says a woman who can bake like you do is wasted on town living." Sam's a flatterer, but she smiled, pleased. "Though I do miss having a proper garden. This little patch barely grows enough for preserving." "The Double M has more garden space than we know what to do with," Thomas said carefully. "Goes mostly to waste. Sam tries, but he hasn't got the touch for it." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the air between them shimmered with possibility. Then Eliza looked away, rising to check something on the stove that didn't need checking. "I should tell you," she said with her back to him. "People are talking. Mrs. Wellington made sure to inform me yesterday that my situation was becoming quite the topic at her sewing circle." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Let them talk." "Easy for you to say." She turned back, her expression a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "You're Thomas McGraw, successful rancher. I'm the widow Carter, who takes in mending and lives on the outskirts. We don't exist in the same world, don't we?" He stood, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Seems to me we've been sharing the same world quite comfortably these past weeks." The tension stretched between them, delicate as spun glass. Eliza's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a dish towel. "You should go, before the weather turns." But Thomas didn't move. "Eliza," he stopped, her given name strange and sweet on his tongue. "Mrs. Carter, I'm not good with words. Never have been, but I know what I feel when I'm here. And I hope you feel it too. She closed her eyes briefly. What I feel doesn't matter. What matters is what this town will do with those feelings. You have a reputation to maintain, a business that depends on respect. I won't be the reason. You won't be the reason for anything except my happiness. Thomas interrupted, then caught himself. I'm sorry. I'm moving too fast. It's just, I've spent so many years alone, and these weeks with you. A knock at the door shattered the moment. They sprang apart like guilty children, though they'd done nothing improper. Eliza smoothed her hair before answering. Mary Patterson stood on the porch, but her usual friendly demeanor was replaced by worry. Eliza, I had to warn you. Frank Morrison's been drinking and talking ugly in town. Says he's coming to collect what he's owed for all his kindness. Sheriff Daniels is trying to calm him down, but I'll handle Morrison, Thomas said quietly. Appearing behind Eliza, Mary's eyes widened at finding him there, but she had the grace not to comment. He's got others with him. Railroad crew, maybe 5 or 6. Then I'll handle them too. Thomas's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd faced down trouble before. Mrs. Patterson, might I ask you to stay with Mrs. Carter for a bit? Thomas, no, Eliza protested. This isn't your fight. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that made Mary Patterson turn away with a knowing smile. It became my fight the moment he troubled you, Thomas said simply. Before Eliza could argue further, he was gone, striding toward town with purpose. The two women watched from the window as his figure disappeared into the gathering dusk. So, Mary said after a moment, Thomas McGraw. Eliza sank into a chair. Don't start. I'm not starting anything, just observing that I haven't seen you look at anyone like that since Nathan. Mary sat beside her, taking her hand. And I haven't seen anyone look at you the way he does, ever. It's impossible. But even as Eliza said it, her heart argued otherwise. These weeks of careful visits, of shared coffee and conversation, had awakened something she'd thought dead with Nathan. Thomas's quiet strength, his respectful attention, the way he actually saw her as more than the tragic widow. It had all combined to crack the walls she'd built around her heart. Love usually is impossible, Mary said gently. That's what makes it worth fighting for. They waited in tense silence, straining for any sound from town. The minutes stretched like hours until finally, they heard footsteps on the porch. Eliza flew to the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of Thomas, disheveled but apparently unharmed. It's handled, he said simply. Morrison won't trouble you again. What did you... Sheriff Daniels was already there when I arrived. Seems Morrison had outstanding warrants from Colorado. He and his friends are enjoying the hospitality of the jail tonight and likely heading back to face charges tomorrow. Mary made her excuses and left, but not before giving Eliza a meaningful look. Alone again. Thomas and Eliza faced each other in the lamplight. You could have been hurt, she said softly. So could you. He stepped closer, and this time she didn't move away. I meant what I said earlier. These feelings, they're real. I know. The admission came out barely above a whisper. That's what terrifies me. I've lost once. Thomas, I don't think I could survive it again. His hand found hers, work-roughened fingers gentle as they intertwined. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. This is Wyoming. Bad things happen all the time, but I can promise to face whatever comes together. If you'll have me. Eliza looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. What she saw there, hope, fear, determination, and something deeper, mirror her own feelings. The town will talk. They're already talking. Your business. We'll be fine, and if it's not, I'll build another. Thomas. He silenced her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. I've been alone a long time. Eliza built my ranch, made my fortune, earned my respect. None of it means anything compared to how I feel when I see you smile, when you hand me coffee and ask about my day, when you pretend those shirts actually need mending just so I have an excuse to visit." She laughed despite herself, a sound rusty from disuse. "You knew." "I'm not quite the fool I appear." His thumb traced circles on her palm, the simple touch sending warmth through her entire body. "Though I am fool enough to hope you might consider letting me court you properly." The word hung between them. Court. Not just visit, not just share coffee, but actually pursue something real, something the town would see and judge and gossip about endlessly. "Yes," Eliza heard herself say, surprising them both. "Yes, I'll let you court me, though I warn you, I'm out of practice. And I make terrible coffee." "Your coffee is perfect," Thomas said fervently, then caught himself. "That is, it's perfectly adequate. I mean—" She laughed again, fuller this time, and impulsively rose on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Thank you, for earlier, for everything." He touched the spot where her lips had been, wonder in his eyes. "I should go, before I do something that really sets the town talking." But he lingered, reluctant to break the spell. "Sunday dinner at the ranch proper chaperoned. Sam will be there." "I'd like that." She walked him to the door, their hands still loosely linked. "Thomas, my coffee really is terrible. I've just been giving you the good stuff because, well, because you like me," he finished, grinning boyishly. "Because I like you," she confirmed, marveling at how easy it was to say. After he left, Eliza stood at her window watching until even the shadow of him had vanished. Her lips still tingled from that brief kiss, her hand still warm from his touch. Outside, stars were beginning to appear in the clear winter sky, each one bright with possibility. She thought of Nathan, of the life they'd planned and lost. He would have liked Thomas, she realized, would have appreciated his steady strength, his quiet humor, his integrity, and he would have wanted this for her, this second chance at happiness, this unexpected spring after such a long winter. At her work table, the shirts Thomas had brought lay waiting. She fingered the loose button, shaking her head at his transparent excuse. Tomorrow, she'd strengthen every seam, secure every button so thoroughly he'd have no reason to return. Except now he didn't need reasons. Now he could simply come because he wanted to, because she wanted him to. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. But as she settled into work, humming a half-remembered tune from her girlhood, Eliza Carter felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years' hope. It flickered inside her like a candle flame, fragile but persistent, casting new light on a life she'd thought forever shadowed. In town, the gossip mills were already churning. By morning, everyone would know that Thomas McGraw had confronted Frank Morrison over the widow Carter, that he'd been seen at her cabin again, that something was definitely brewing between the successful rancher and the woman who'd buried her heart with her husband. But for tonight, in her small cabin on the edge of respectability, Eliza allowed herself to dream of Sunday dinner, of a garden with room to grow, of coffee shared not in careful propriety, but in easy companionship. She thought of Thomas's words, burned stronger than fire, though he hadn't said them yet. Somehow, she felt them anyway, warming her from within like flames that no winter wind could extinguish. The March blizzard struck without mercy, turning the Wyoming sky into a churning wall of white. Thomas had seen it coming in the way the horses grew restless and the cattle bunched together. But nothing could have prepared him for the fury that descended upon the Double M Ranch. For 3 days straight, the wind howled like a living thing, driving snow through every crack in the barn walls. Thomas and Sam worked in shifts, fighting to keep the animals alive. They strung rope guidelines between buildings after Charlie Briggs. One of the younger hands got lost between the barn and bunkhouse. They found him 20 feet off course, nearly frozen. Lost another 2 heifers. Sam reported on the 4th morning. Ice crystals in his beard catching the lantern light. Found him by the north fence. Looks like they tried to find shelter against the posts. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. That made 7 cattle total, plus a horse that had panicked and broken its leg. Each loss cut deep. Not just financially, but personally. He knew every animal on his ranch, had raised most from birth. "How's the feed holding out?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Another week, maybe 2 if we stretch it thin." Sam's weathered face showed the strain of the past days. "Tom, we might need to think about—" "We're not culling the herd." Thomas's voice was firm. "Not yet. This storm has to break soon." But it didn't. For another 2 days, the blizzard raged, and Thomas felt each hour in his bones. He'd sent most of the hands to town before the storm hit, keeping only Sam and Charlie to help. Now he wondered if that had been wise. 3 men against nature's fury seemed woefully inadequate. On the 6th day, the wind finally began to die. Thomas stood in the barn door, surveying the damage. Snowdrifts reached halfway up the buildings. Fence posts had vanished entirely. The landscape he knew like his own reflection had been transformed into an alien world of white. "Boss," Charlie's voice cracked with urgency from the direction of the cattle pen. "We got trouble." Thomas waded through hip-deep snow to find a section of fence had collapsed under the weight. The surviving cattle had wandered out, scattering across the range. In their weakened state, they wouldn't last long. "Saddle up," he told Charlie. "We need every head we can find." They worked through the day, Thomas on Duchess and Charlie on a sturdy mare, searching for black shapes against the white expanse. By evening, they'd recovered most of the herd, but Thomas's mental tally came up short by at least a dozen. That night, exhaustion weighing on him like a physical force. Thomas sat at his kitchen table trying to make the numbers work. The losses from the storm, combined with feed costs and repairs, had put a serious dent in his reserves. He wasn't ruined, not yet, but another blow like this would push him dangerously close. A soft knock interrupted his calculations. Thomas opened the door to find Eliza standing there, wrapped in a heavy cloak and carrying a covered basket. "Eliza, what are you doing here, the roads?" "Are terrible, I know." She pushed past him, bringing the scent of fresh bread and something else, apple pie. He realized. "Mary's husband brought me in his sledge. He's helping Sam in the barn." Thomas watched, stunned, as she efficiently unpacked her basket. Fresh bread, a pot of stew still warm, dried apples, preserves. "You shouldn't have come. It's dangerous." She turned to face him, hands on her hips. "Thomas McGraw, you look like you haven't eaten properly in a week. When was the last time you had a hot meal?" He couldn't remember. They'd been living on coffee and whatever they could grab between checking the animals. "Eliza?" "Sit," she commanded, already ladling stew into a bowl. "Eat, then we'll talk about you trying to handle everything alone." The stew was heaven thick with vegetables and tender meat, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. Thomas ate like a starving man while Eliza moved around his kitchen, noting supplies and making disapproving sounds at the state of his pantry. "How bad is it?" she asked finally, sitting across from him. Thomas wanted to lie, to protect her from his troubles, but something in her steady gaze demanded honesty. "Bad. Lost at least 20 head, maybe more. Feed's running low. And this is supposed to be a mild winter. What do you need?" "A miracle." He pushed the empty bowl aside. "Or about $600 for feed and repairs." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have 300 saved. It's yours." "Absolutely not." The refusal came instantly. "I won't take your money, Eliza." "It's not taking if I'm offering." Her chin lifted in that stubborn way he'd come to recognize. Partners help each other. "We're not—" He stopped, realizing what she'd said. "Partners." Color rose in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "Aren't we these past weeks? I've spent more time worrying about this ranch than my own troubles. When the storm hit, all I could think about was whether you had enough help, enough food, enough." She broke off, emotions overwhelming her composed facade. Thomas reached across the table, taking her hand. "We can't be partners if you're living in town while I'm out here." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. They'd been courting for nearly a month, careful public outings chaperoned by Sam or Mary. But this felt different. This felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. "What are you saying?" Eliza's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm saying—" Thomas took a breath, gathering courage he'd never needed when facing down wolves or claim jumpers. "I'm saying I want you here. Not just visiting, not just helping. Here as my wife, as my partner in everything." "Thomas, I know it's too soon. I know the proper thing would be to court you for a year, to do this right. But Eliza, I lay in that cold bed every night thinking about you. When the storm hit, when I thought I might lose everything, the only thing that really mattered was that I hadn't told you how I feel." She was crying now, silent tears that she didn't try to hide. "The town?" "We'll talk no matter what we do. At least this way, we face them together." "I'm still in mourning. Nathan's been gone 3 years. Do you think he'd want you to spend your life alone?" Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "I didn't know him well, but any man lucky enough to have your love would want you to find happiness again." Eliza stood abruptly, walking to the window. Outside, the snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly, beautiful and brutal. "I swore I'd never risk this again, never put myself in a position to lose everything." Thomas rose too, standing behind her but not touching. "Life's a risk, Eliza. This ranch, your cabin, every sunrise, it's all a gamble. The only choice we get is whether to face it alone or together." She turned then, and what he saw in her eyes made his heart race. "I can't give you children. Thomas, the doctor said, after what happened when Nathan and I tried, I can't." "I'm not asking for children. I'm asking for you. I have nightmares sometimes. About the ambush." "Then I'll hold you until they pass." "I can't cook as well as I bake." "Sam will be thrilled. He's been trying to poison me for years." That surprised a laugh out of her, watery but genuine. "This is insane." "Probably." Thomas risked reaching out, cupping her face gently. "But I've been sane and alone for 36 years. I'd like to try something different." She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Ask me again?" "Eliza Carter, will you marry me? Will you share my life, my ranch, my troubles, and whatever joys we can find in this hard land?" "Yes," the word came out strong and sure. "Yes, Thomas McGraw, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, their first real kiss, and it was everything he'd imagined and more. Her lips were soft, but her response was fierce. Years of loneliness and longing poured into this one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "When?" she asked, practical even in her joy. "Soon as the road's clear, we'll go to town, see Reverend Mills." Thomas pulled her close, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "Unless you want to wait, do this properly." "I've had proper—" Eliza interrupted. "I had a church wedding with flowers and a white dress and a reception at the hotel. And then I had 3 years of sleeping alone. I don't need proper— Thomas, I need you." They stood there in his kitchen, holding each other while outside the wind picked up again. But inside was warmth and light, and the promise of a future neither had dared imagine. "I should warn you," Thomas said against her hair. "The ranch house is barely fit for a bachelor. You'll probably want to change everything." "I'll want to add curtains," she admitted, "and rugs, and possibly plates that match." "Done." "And that garden you mentioned, I'll need twice the space." "Yours." "And Thomas," she pulled back to look at him, "the next time there's a storm, you send for me. Partners face troubles together." He kissed her again in answer, tasting apple pie and promises on her lips. Outside, snow began to fall once more. But inside Thomas McGraw's heart, spring had already arrived. When Bill Patterson came to collect Eliza an hour later, he found them sitting respectably at the kitchen table, making plans, but something in their faces must have given them away, because he grinned knowingly. "About time," was all he said, helping Eliza into the sledge. "Mary's been planning your wedding for weeks." As Thomas watched them disappear into the snowy darkness, he felt lighter than he had in years despite his troubles. The ranch problems remained. The financial pressures hadn't vanished, but now he wouldn't face them alone. Back inside, he found the $300 Eliza had somehow slipped into his ledger when he wasn't looking. A note was attached. "Partners share burdens as well as blessings. Don't you dare try to return this." Thomas laughed, the sound echoing through his empty house. Soon it wouldn't be empty anymore. Soon there would be curtains and rugs and matching plates. There would be fresh bread and terrible coffee, and someone to hold when nightmares came. There would be arguments about money and worries about weather and all the 1,000 challenges of ranch life. He could hardly wait. That night, as he lay in his cold bed for what he knew would be one of the last times alone, Thomas McGraw whispered into the darkness, "I only wanted warmth on my bed. But Eliza, your kiss burned stronger than fire." The words felt like a prophecy, a promise of heat and light in the cold Wyoming night. And somewhere across the snowy miles, in a small cabin on the edge of town, Eliza Carter lay in her own bed, touching her lips and feeling the echo of that same fire, burning away 3 years of winter to reveal the possibility of spring. The stranger rode into Willow Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, dust swirling around his horse's hooves like smoke from distant fires. Jesse Malone had aged hard in the 5 years since the ambush at Devil's Canyon, prison etching lines into his face that told stories of violence and survival. But his eyes remained sharp as flint, scanning the town that had once known him as a wanted man. At Henderson's General Store, conversations died as he entered. John Henderson's hand moved casually toward the shotgun beneath his counter, though Jesse pretended not to notice. "Jesse Malone," Henderson said, his voice carefully neutral. "Heard you were doing time in Colorado." "Did my time," Jesse replied, selecting tobacco with deliberate slowness. "Paid my debt, as they say. Now I'm back to collect what's owed to me." "Nothing's owed to you here." Jesse's smile was cold as winter wind. "We'll see about that." He tossed coins on the counter. "The Carter woman still living here." Henderson's face went rigid. "Mrs. McGraw lives out at the Double M Ranch now. Married Thomas McGraw 2 weeks past." Something dangerous flickered in Jesse's eyes. "McGraw, the rancher with all that prime grazing land north of town?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Well, isn't that convenient?" The widow found herself another man to hide behind. Mrs. McGraw isn't hiding from anything," Henderson said firmly, "and Thomas McGraw isn't Nathan Carter." "No," Jesse agreed, heading for the door. "Nathan Carter made the mistake of playing hero. Let's hope McGraw's smarter than that." Word spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By evening, Sheriff Bill Daniels was sitting in Thomas McGraw's kitchen, his weathered face grave with concern. "Jesse Malone's bad news, Tom," Bill said, accepting coffee from Eliza with a grateful nod. "Served 3 years for robbery, but we all know he did worse. The only witness to what really happened at Devil's Canyon was Nathan Carter, and dead men don't testify." Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Thomas reached for her, drawing her close. These 2 weeks of marriage had only deepened the connection between them, and he could feel her tension like it was his own. "What's he want?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Officially, nothing illegal. He's served his time, has every right to be here." Bill shifted uncomfortably. "Unofficially, word is he's been asking about property rights, water access, grazing permits. And he's been particularly interested in the Double M's north pasture. The one that borders Coyote Creek, Thomas said grimly. That pasture was the heart of his ranch, with the best water access in 50 miles. He can ask all he wants. That land's not for sale. Men like Jesse don't usually ask, Bill warned. They take. After the sheriff left, Thomas found Eliza standing at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling the rigid set of her shoulders. "Talk to me," he murmured. "He killed Nathan." Her voice was flat, controlled. "Oh, the Colton gang pulled the triggers, but Jesse planned it. He knew the sheriff would form a posse, knew Nathan would volunteer. The robbery was just bait." "Why? What did Nathan ever do to him?" Eliza turned in his arms, her eyes haunted. Nathan testified against Jesse's brother 5 years before. Cattle rustling. His brother died in prison, and Jesse swore revenge. He always keeps his promises. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "And now he's here for you." "For me. For you. For this land." She touched his face gently. "I've brought danger to your door. Thomas, maybe I should—" "Don't!" His voice was firm. "Don't even think about leaving. We face this together, remember?" She kissed him then, fierce and desperate. "I can't lose you two. I won't survive it." "You won't have to." But even as he held her, Thomas felt the weight of approaching storm. Men like Jesse Malone didn't forgive, didn't forget, didn't stop until they got what they wanted. And what Jesse wanted, apparently, was everything Thomas held dear. The next morning brought 2 more riders to the Double M. Sam met them at the gate, rifle prominently displayed, but they made no aggressive moves. "We're here to see Mr. McGraw," one said, "about employment opportunities." Thomas studied them from the porch. Hard men, both of them, with the look of those who'd ridden dark trails. "I'm not hiring." "Oh, mister, Malone thought you might reconsider," the second man said. "Times are tough. Ranches need protection. Accidents happen." "Is that a threat?" "Just an observation." The first man smiled thinly. "Shame about Will Patterson's barn last month. Lightning's unpredictable in these parts." Thomas's jaw tightened. Patterson's barn had burned under suspicious circumstances, though nothing was ever proved. "Get off my land, now!" They left without argument, but their message was clear. Jesse was building a presence, gathering men, setting the stage for something larger. Over the next week, the pressure mounted. Fences were cut in the night, letting cattle wander. A water hole was fouled with a dead deer. Small harassments. Nothing that could be definitively traced to Jesse, but the pattern was unmistakable. 16 head missing. Sam reported grimly one morning. Tracks lead toward the hills, but they're clever about it, staying off the main trails. Thomas slammed his fist on the table, making Eliza jump. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. Seeing her flinch, I can't fight shadows. If Jesse wants something, let him come for it directly." "That's not his way," Eliza said quietly. "He'll wear you down first, make you desperate, then offer to buy the ranch for half its worth, presenting it as generous given your troubles." "You sound like you've seen this before." "I have. Nathan and I watched him do it to the Hendricks family. They held out for months before their well was poisoned and their youngest took sick from bad water." Her voice hardened. "They sold in the end. Most do." That night, unable to sleep, Thomas sat by the fire cleaning his rifle while Eliza worked on a quilt. The domestic scene felt surreal given the danger pressing in around them. "I've been thinking," Eliza said suddenly. "Jesse's weakness was always his pride. He needs people to know how clever he is, needs them to fear him. What if we deny him that?" "What do you mean?" "What if we make the first move not violence?" she added quickly. seeing his expression. Something unexpected, something that puts him off balance. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. He grabbed his rifle, pushing Eliza behind him as he moved to the window. 4 riders, he said tersely. Coming fast. But as they drew closer, Thomas recognized the lead figure. It's Bill, and he's got company. Sheriff Daniels dismounted quickly, his usual calm demeanor replaced by urgency. Tom, Eliza, we've got a problem. Jesse's called a meeting for tomorrow. Says he's got legal claim to part of your land. Some old Spanish grant nonsense. But he's got a lawyer from Denver backing him up. That's impossible, Thomas said. I've got clear title. Maybe so, but he's making it public. Called for a town meeting to resolve the dispute peacefully. Bill's expression was grim. Half the town's scared of him. The other half thinks there might be something to it. You need to be there. After the sheriff left, Thomas and Eliza sat in stunned silence. This was Jesse's masterstroke. Not violence, but the veneer of legitimacy. If he could cloud the title, create doubt, he might force a sale without firing a shot. It's lies, Thomas said finally. All of it. Of course it is. Eliza stood, pacing with a restless energy. But lies told well enough become truth in people's minds. Jesse knows that. Thomas watched his wife move through their home. Their home, he reminded himself. No matter what Jesse Malone claimed, the lamplight caught in her dark hair, illuminated the determined set of her jaw. She'd survived loss before, rebuilt her life from ashes. Now she was prepared to fight for this new life they'd built together. What are you thinking? He asked. She turned to him, a strange smile playing at her lips. I'm thinking Jesse made a mistake coming here. He remembers the woman who lost her husband, who ran away to hide in town. He doesn't know the woman who survived that loss, who found love again, who'll do whatever it takes to protect what's hers. Eliza. I kept quiet before because I was alone, because I had no power, but I'm not alone now. She moved to him, fierce and beautiful in her determination. And I have something Jesse never expected, proof. Proof of what? Of what really happened at Devil's Canyon. Nathan left a letter, hidden where only I would find it. He suspected Jesse was planning something, wanted insurance. Her smile was sharp as a blade. I never used it because I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore. Thomas pulled her close, feeling the trembling strength in her small frame. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, would force them to face Jesse's lies in front of the whole town. But tonight, they had each other, and the truth, and the kind of love that burned hot enough to forge steel from iron. Together, he murmured into her hair. Together, she agreed. And in that word was both promise and threat. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, nature itself seeming to sense the coming conflict. But inside the ranch house, two people who'd found each other against all odds prepared to face whatever morning would bring. Jesse Malone had returned expecting to find victims. Instead, he'd find something far more dangerous. A united front, backed by love and truth and the kind of courage that only comes from having something worth fighting for. The game was no longer Jesse's alone, and for the first time in 5 years, the ghost of Nathan Carter might finally see justice done. The acrid smell of smoke woke Thomas from restless sleep. He bolted upright, instinctively reaching for Eliza, but her side of the bed was empty. Through the window, an orange glow painted the night sky in shades of hell. The barn! Sam's voice carried across the yard, high with panic. Fire in the barn! Thomas pulled on his boots and ran, the cold night air sharp against his lungs. The stable was fully ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the timber frame. The screams of trapped horses pierced the roar of the fire. "Where's Eliza?" he shouted at Sam, who was struggling with a bucket brigade that was pitifully inadequate against the inferno. "She ran to town for help," Charlie Briggs called back, his face black with soot. "Said to save what horses we could." Thomas didn't hesitate. He wrapped his shirt around his face and plunged into the smoke-filled structure. Duchess was in there, along with 6 other horses. The heat was overwhelming, pressing against him like a living thing. He found the mare's stall by memory more than sight, her terror evident in the whites of her rolling eyes. "Easy, girl," he crooned, fumbling with the latch. "We're getting out of here." One by one, he and his men led horses to safety, the animals wild with fear but trusting enough to follow. They saved 5. The 6th, a young colt, they could hear but couldn't reach before a beam crashed down, blocking the way. As Thomas emerged for the last time, coughing and singed, he saw riders approaching, but instead of help from town, it was Jesse Malone and 3 of his men, sitting their horses at a safe distance, watching the destruction with satisfied expressions. "Shame about your barn. McGraw," Jesse called out, having to raise his voice over the crackling flames. "These old structures, they're like tinder. One spark and whoosh." "You did this." It wasn't a question. Jesse spread his hands in mock innocence. "Now why would I do such a thing? I was in town all evening. Plenty of witnesses at the saloon. Just heard about the fire and rode out to offer neighborly assistance." "Get off my land!" Thomas's voice was deadly quiet. "Certainly, but think about my offer. McGraw, this ranch seems to be having a run of bad luck. Might be wise to sell while you still have something left to sell." Jesse touched his hat brim mockingly. "Ma'am." Thomas turned to see Eliza approaching on foot, having run back from town. Her face was pale but determined as she watched Jesse's group ride away. "The sheriff's coming," she said breathlessly. "But Jesse was in town all evening." "I know." Thomas pulled her against him, not caring that he was covered in soot and stinking of smoke. "He's escalating." They spent the rest of the night trying to save what they could. By dawn, the barn was a smoldering ruin, black timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Sheriff Daniels arrived with the sunrise, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. Jesse Malone was in the Lucky Dollar until midnight. Bill reported, 20 people saw him, his men too. Then he hired someone else, Thomas said flatly. "Probably, but proving it." Bill shook his head. "Tom, I've got to ask, that offer he mentioned. He wants to buy the ranch, half what it's worth. And the town meeting, is this afternoon?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Perfect timing. Wouldn't you say?" Eliza had been silent, staring at the ruins. Now she turned, her face set with determination. "We're still going, and we're still fighting. Eliza, maybe we should consider—" "No," her voice cut like steel. "He thinks he's broken us, thinks we'll slink into that meeting defeated, ready to accept whatever terms he offers. He's wrong." The town hall was packed by 3 o'clock. It seemed every soul in Willow Creek had come to witness the confrontation. Jesse sat at the front, flanked by a thin man in a city suit who could only be his Denver lawyer. They radiated confidence. Thomas and Eliza entered together, her hand firmly in his. Despite the night's ordeal, they'd cleaned up and dressed carefully. They would not appear as victims. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Thornwood began nervously, "we're here to address a dispute regarding property boundaries at the Double M Ranch. Mr. Crane from Denver has documentation to present." The lawyer stood, producing papers with a flourish. "My client's family has prior claim to the northern section of what is currently called the Double M Ranch, based on a Spanish land grant from 1791. The documentation clearly shows—" "The documentation shows nothing," Eliza interrupted, standing, "because it's forged." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jesse's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Mrs. McGraw," the mayor said, "please allow Mr. Crane to finish." "No." Eliza moved to the front, her small figure commanding attention. "I've held my peace for 3 years while this man walked free. but I won't stand by while he steals from us with paper instead of bullets." "That's a serious accusation," Crane blustered. "My client—" "Your client is a killer." Eliza's voice rang clear. "And I can prove it." She produced a leather portfolio from her bag. "My late husband, Nathan Carter, wrote this letter the night before he died." He suspected Jesse was planning something, though he didn't know what. He details Jesse's threats, his past crimes, and names witnesses who were too frightened to come forward. Jesse was on his feet now. "That proves nothing. A dead man's paranoia." "There's more." Eliza pulled out another document. A signed statement from Miguel Vasquez, who worked for the original Spanish grant holders. He testifies that all rights were legally sold to the American government in 1848, then properly homesteaded by Thomas's father in 1871. Your documents, Mr. Crane, are clever forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. The crowd was buzzing now, sentiment shifting palpably. Jesse's controlled mask slipped, revealing the fury beneath. "You lying witch!" he snarled. "Just like your husband, always meddling where you don't belong." "Is that a confession?" Sheriff Daniels stood, hand on his gun. "Sounds like you're admitting to involvement in Nathan Carter's death." The room exploded into chaos. Jesse's men went for their guns, but the sheriff had positioned deputies strategically. The Denver lawyer tried to flee but was caught at the door. In the melee, Jesse lunged for Eliza. Thomas intercepted him, the two men crashing into chairs. They grappled furiously, years of suppressed rage finally given outlet. Jesse was vicious, but Thomas was stronger, fueled by protective fury. They rolled across the floor, fists flying, until Thomas managed to pin Jesse down. "Enough!" Sheriff Daniels' voice boomed over the chaos. "Everyone freeze or I start shooting." Slowly, order was restored. Jesse's men were disarmed and cuffed. The lawyer babbled about not knowing the documents were forged, and Jesse himself, nose bloodied and eye swelling, was hauled to his feet by two deputies. "Jesse Malone," Bill Daniels said formally. "I'm arresting you for arson, conspiracy to defraud, and suspicion of murder in the death of Nathan Carter. You'll be held pending transport to federal authorities." As they dragged Jesse past, he locked eyes with Eliza. "This isn't over," he hissed. "I've got friends. You'll never be safe." "I'll take my chances," she replied steadily. After the prisoners were removed and the crowd began to disperse, Thomas and Eliza stood in the empty hall. He touched his split lip gingerly, wincing. "You're hurt," she said softly, reaching up to examine the damage. "Worth it." He caught her hand, kissing her palm. "That letter from Nathan was real. I found it hidden in his workshop months after he died. I was too scared to use it then. Too broken." She smiled sadly. "But I'm not that woman anymore." "No," Thomas agreed, pulling her close. "You're stronger, braver, more beautiful than ever." "We lost the barn," she reminded him. "We'll build another, better than before." He tipped her chin up. Jesse was wrong. This is over. We won. But even as they held each other, both knew the victory had come at a cost. The barn was gone, taking with it feed, equipment, and one innocent colt. The ranch's finances, already strained, would be pushed to the breaking point by rebuilding. That evening, as they stood watching the sunset paint the ruins of their barn in softer shades, neighbors began arriving. The Pattersons brought lumber. The Hendersons offered labor. Mary arrived with a wagon full of food and a determined expression. "You stood up to him," she said simply. "Now we stand with you." As darkness fell, the yard filled with lanterns and people. Men discussed rebuilding plans, while women organized food and supplies. Children played between the wagons, their laughter a counterpoint to the serious adult conversations. "A barn raising," old Sam said, grinning his gap-toothed smile. "Haven't seen one in years. We'll have you fixed up in no time, boss. Thomas looked around at the gathering crowd, then at Eliza beside him. She was smiling, tears streaming down her face as she watched their community rally around them. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "I'm thinking about fire," she said. "How it can destroy. Yes, but also how it can forge. How it can bring light in darkness. How it can warm a home and hearts alike." She rose on her toes and kissed him, there in front of everyone. Propriety be damned. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears and fierce joy. "Your kiss," she whispered, "burns stronger than any fire Jesse Malone could set, and that's a flame that will never be extinguished." Thomas held her close as their neighbors and friends continued to arrive, bringing hope and help in equal measure. The Double M Ranch had survived its trial by fire. Jesse Malone was heading for justice long delayed, and two people who had found each other across loss and loneliness stood together, ready to rebuild not just a barn, but a life filled with the kind of love that could withstand any storm. The stars came out one by one overhead, bearing witness to the simple truth that community and courage, love and determination would always triumph over hatred and greed. In the morning, they would begin again, but tonight they were home. The morning after the town meeting dawned gray and bitter, matching the somber mood that had settled over the Double M Ranch. Sheriff Bill Daniels lay in Doc Morrison's surgery, a bullet lodged near his spine. He'd been ambushed on the road while transporting Jesse Malone to the federal marshals. Jesse and two of his men had escaped in the chaos. "He can't feel his legs," Doc Morrison told Thomas and Eliza quietly in the front room. "The bullet's too close to the spine. If I try to remove it..." "He could die," Thomas finished grimly, "or be paralyzed permanently. Right now, there's still hope the swelling will go down. Feeling might return." The doctor rubbed his tired eyes. "But Bill's days of sheriffing are over, regardless." Eliza gripped Thomas's hand tightly. Bill Daniels had been one of their few true allies, a man of integrity in a town often ruled by fear. Now he might never walk again because he'd stood with them against Jesse. Outside, the skeleton of their new barn rose against the sky. Abandoned mid-construction when word came of the ambush, the community that had rallied to help them had retreated to their homes. Doors locked, afraid of becoming Jesse's next target. "I should have killed him," Thomas said as they walked back to the ranch. "When I had him pinned in the town hall..." "You're not a killer," Eliza replied firmly. "That's what separates us from men like him. Noble principles won't protect us when he comes." And Thomas knew he would come. Jesse Malone wasn't the type to run far. He'd tasted humiliation, seen his plans crumble. He'd want revenge before disappearing. They found Sam organizing the remaining ranch hands, such as they were. Charlie Briggs had quit that morning, apologizing but firm. "I got family to think of. Mr. McGraw, Jesse's killed before. I can't risk it." Thomas couldn't blame him. Of his original 6 hands, only Sam and Will Patterson remained. And Will only because Mary had shamed him into staying. "We'll manage," Sam said stoutly, though his weathered face showed the strain. "Might have to let the south pasture go wild for a season. Focus on keeping the main herd together. The south pasture's the least of our worries." Thomas replied. He'd done the figures that morning, between the barn fire, lost cattle, and now having to hire guards. The ranch was hemorrhaging money. They had perhaps 2 months before creditors came calling. That evening, Eliza found Thomas in what remained of the stable, tending to Duchess. The mare had been burned on her flank during the fire, and though healing, she remained skittish. "Mary brought news from town," Eliza said. 3 more families are leaving. The Millers, the Youngs, and the Jeffersons. They're scared." "Smart of them." Thomas didn't look up from his work. "Thomas McGraw, you look at me." He turned, surprised by the steel in her voice. Eliza stood with her hands on her hips, eyes blazing. "I know what you're thinking," she continued. You're thinking you should send me away. For my safety. You're thinking you brought this trouble on me by marrying me. Didn't I if I'd left you alone? I'd still be in that cold cabin, mending other people's clothes and dying a little more each day. She moved closer, cupping his face in her hands. You didn't bring me trouble. Thomas, you brought me life, and I'll not let Jesse Malone take that from us. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, lavender soap and wood smoke and something uniquely Eliza. I can't lose you. Then we'd better make sure you don't. That night, they made plans. If Jesse wanted a fight, they'd give him one, but on their terms. Eliza wrote letters to contacts in Denver, including a federal judge Nathan had known. Thomas reached out to neighboring ranchers, reminding them that Jesse's appetite wouldn't stop with a double M. The response was mixed. Some promised help. Others were too frightened or too calculating, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before choosing sides. 3 days later, their preparations were put to the test. Eliza was in the garden when she saw dust rising from the south road. Many riders, coming fast. She ran for the house, ringing the alarm bell as she went. Thomas emerged with his rifle. Sam and Will taking positions at the windows. They drilled this, knowing it would come. What they hadn't expected was for Eliza to grab Nathan's old shotgun from above the mantel. You're staying inside, Thomas ordered. Like hell I am. She checked the loads with practiced efficiency. This is my fight too. There was no time to argue. The riders swept into the yard. 8 men, Jesse at their head. They stayed on horseback, spreading out in a semicircle, cutting off escape routes. McGraw, Jesse called out. Let's discuss this like civilized men. Nothing civilized about you, Malone. Thomas called back. State your business and get off my land. Jesse laughed. Your land, I think we established there's some dispute about that, but I'm willing to be reasonable. You've got 1 hour to pack what you can carry and get out. Leave the deed on the table, and I might let you walk away. Or what? Or we do this the hard way. Jesse's smile was cold. Your choice. But either way, come sundown, this ranch is mine. You're forgetting something. Eliza stepped onto the porch, shotgun steady. We're not alone. As if on cue, riders appeared on the ridge line. John Henderson led them, along with the Pattersons and several other townsmen. Not many, maybe a dozen, but enough to even the odds. Jesse's confidence visibly wavered. You think your shopkeeper friends frighten me? No, Thomas said. But the federal marshal riding in from Cheyenne might do here tomorrow. I believe something about a murdered sheriff and an escaped prisoner. It was a bluff. The marshal was still 3 days out. But Jesse couldn't know that. His men shifted nervously. Fighting ranchers was one thing. Federal law was another. You're lying, Jesse said, but uncertainty colored his voice. Am I care to wait and find out? Thomas kept his voice steady, though his finger tensed on the trigger. Or you could ride out now. California's nice this time of year. Mexico's even better. The standoff stretched taut as wire. Then one of Jesse's men spoke up. This ain't worth a hanging. Jesse, let's go. Shut up, Jesse snarled. But the damage was done. His men were wavering, and he knew it. This isn't over. McGraw, you or your witch wife. Yes, Eliza said clearly. It is. You're done here? Jesse, done terrorizing people, done taking what isn't yours. Ride out now, or stay and face justice. But either way, you've lost. For a moment, rage transformed Jesse's face into something inhuman. His hand twitched toward his gun. Thomas tensed, ready to fire. Then Jesse wheeled his horse around. Move out, he barked at his men. They followed, relief evident in their hurried departure. The defenders stayed in position until the dust settled, then slowly emerged. John Henderson rode down, his usually dour face creased with a grim smile. Thought you might need help, he said simply. Mary Patterson can be very persuasive when she sets her mind to it. As the townsmen departed, promises of continued support ringing somewhat hollow but appreciated nonetheless. Thomas and Eliza stood together in their yard. The ranch was safe for now, but at terrible cost. Bill Daniels might never walk again. Their finances were in ruins. And somewhere out there, Jesse Malone nursed his wounded pride and plotted revenge. "He'll be back," Thomas said quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe he'll run far enough that his shadow no longer falls on us." Eliza leaned against him, exhausted but unbroken. "Either way, we'll face it together." That night, as they lay in bed listening to Sam keeping watch, Eliza traced the new lines on Thomas's face, worry lines, carved by recent events. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for bringing this to your door." "Don't," he caught her hand, kissing it gently. "I told you before. I only wanted warmth on my bed, but you gave me so much more. You gave me something worth fighting for. Even if we lose everything." "We won't lose everything. We have each other. The rest," he shrugged. "The rest is just land and cattle and wood. We can rebuild those." "Thomas McGraw, are you going soft on me?" "Maybe." He pulled her closer. "Or maybe I'm finally understanding what's really important." Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their calls echoing across the empty land. But inside the house, two people who'd found love in the midst of loss held each other close, drawing strength from their bond. The ranch might be wounded, their future uncertain, but their love remained constant, a flame that no amount of darkness could extinguish. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be creditors to face, a ranch to salvage, a life to rebuild. Jesse Malone might return, or he might vanish like smoke on the wind. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, Thomas and Eliza McGraw had won something more valuable than land or gold. They'd proven that love and courage could stand against hate and greed. And in the wild, unforgiving landscape of Wyoming territory, that was no small victory. Spring arrived early that year, painting the Wyoming landscape in shades of green and gold. The Double M Ranch, which had seemed on the verge of collapse just months before, now showed signs of renewal. The new barn stood complete, raised by neighbors who'd remembered Thomas and Eliza's courage. Fresh fence posts marked restored boundaries, and the sound of hammering echoed across the valley as Sam directed repairs to the outbuildings. Thomas stood on the porch, watching Eliza work in her expanded garden. She'd insisted on doubling its size, saying they'd need every vegetable they could grow to make it through the year. But he knew the truth. She was planting hope as much as seeds, creating beauty from the ashes of their trials. "Letter came," Sam called out. "Riding up from town? From Denver?" Thomas's stomach tightened as he took the envelope. These days, letters from Denver usually meant legal troubles or creditors. But Eliza's face lit up when she saw the return address. "It's from Judge Morrison," she said, wiping dirt from her hands. "Nathan's old friend." They read together, hardly daring to breathe. The judge wrote that Jesse Malone had been captured trying to rob a stage near the Colorado border. During the arrest, he'd confessed to several crimes, including orchestrating Nathan Carter's death. He would hang within the month. "It's over," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's really over." Thomas held her as she cried. Tears of relief, of grief finally given closure, of a chapter finally closed. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear and bright. "Now we can truly begin," she said. The ranch's resurrection hadn't been easy. They'd sold off part of the south pasture to cover immediate debts, a painful but necessary sacrifice. Thomas had taken on freight hauling contracts to bring in extra money, spending long days on the road. Eliza had returned to her sewing, but now she worked from their home, creating beautiful quilts that sold for good prices in Denver. Most surprising had been the town's transformation. Sheriff Daniels, though confined to a wheeled chair, had returned to duty with a fierce determination. His brush with death had only strengthened his resolve to see justice done. The fear that had gripped Willow Creek began to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of community. "You've got visitors," Sam announced one afternoon, gesturing toward an approaching wagon. Thomas tensed from habit, but relaxed when he recognized the Hendersons' rig. John Henderson had become an unexpected ally. His respect earned through their stand against Jessie, his wife, who'd once looked down on Eliza, now brought her sewing work regularly. "Thought you might need these," Henderson said, unloading several young fruit trees. "Apple and cherry. Figured your wife might want to start an orchard." Eliza's delight was worth more than gold. She directed the planting with enthusiasm, describing where each tree would go, how they'd blossom in spring, the preserves she'd make from their fruit. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas reflected on how much had changed. The ranch was smaller but more manageable. Their savings were gone, but their debt was clear. Most importantly, the house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with Eliza's laughter, her singing as she worked, her gentle breathing beside him at night. "I've been thinking," Eliza said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what you said that night during the storm, about only wanting warmth on your bed." Thomas smiled, remembering. "And you gave me so much more." "Did I?" She turned to face him, her expression serious. "Sometimes I wonder if I brought you more trouble than warmth. The fire, Jessie, nearly losing everything." "Stop!" He pulled her onto his lap, not caring if Sam or anyone else might see. "You brought me life. Eliza McGraw. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions, building something that had no meaning because I had no one to share it with." "Sweet talker," she murmured, but her eyes were bright. "Truth teller," he corrected. "Your kiss did burn stronger than fire. Burned away the loneliness, the emptiness, the fear of trying again. Even if we'd lost the ranch entirely, it would have been worth it." She kissed him then, soft and deep, tasting of coffee and promises kept. When they parted, both were breathless. "The ranch hands will gossip," she warned, though she made no move to leave his embrace. "Let them. A man's allowed to kiss his wife on his own porch." As if to prove his point, he kissed her again, longer this time, until Sam's exaggerated coughing from the barn made them break apart laughing. The weeks turned to months, and slowly the Double M found its rhythm again. The cattle thrived on the spring grass. The garden produced abundantly. Eliza's skill coaxing vegetables from soil that had never been cultivated. The fruit trees, though young, showed promise of future harvests. Bill Daniels visited regularly, his wheeled chair navigating the ranch paths with surprising agility. He'd taken on a deputy who handled the physical aspects of law enforcement, but Bill's sharp mind and hard-won wisdom made him more effective than ever. "Funny how things work out," he mused one afternoon, watching Eliza serve lemonade to a group of town children who'd come to see the new foal. "Sometimes the worst storms bring the brightest clearing." Thomas nodded, understanding. The trials they'd faced had forged something stronger than what existed before, not just in their marriage, but in the community itself. Willow Creek had learned to stand together against fear. The Double M had become a symbol of resilience. "Mr. McGraw," one of the children called out. Mrs. McGraw says you can lift a whole calf, is that true?" Thomas grinned, flexing theatrically. "Well now, that depends on the size of the calf." The children giggled, and Eliza shot him an affectionate look that warmed him more than any fire. This was what he'd wanted, he realized. Not just warmth on his bed, but life in his home. Children's laughter, even if they weren't his own. A partner who challenged and supported him in equal measure. A future bright with possibility. That night, as spring rain pattered gently on the roof, Thomas and Eliza lay entwined in their bed. The other side was no longer cold and empty. It was filled with her presence, her warmth, Her love. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Giving up your independence, taking on the ranch troubles." "Independence is overrated," she replied, tracing patterns on his chest. "I was independent for 3 years. I was also alone, afraid, barely surviving. Us, it's not a cage, Thomas, it's wings." He thought about that as thunder rumbled in the distance. She was right. Together. They'd soared higher than either could have alone. They'd faced down storms, both literal and figurative. They'd rebuilt from ashes, replanted after destruction, found joy after sorrow. "I love you," he said, words that still felt new and precious on his tongue. "And I love you," she replied, snuggling closer. "Even if you do track mud through my clean kitchen and forget to close the garden gate." That was 1 time. 3 times. But who's counting? They laughed quietly, mindful of Sam sleeping in the bunkhouse. Outside, the rain intensified, but inside they were warm and safe and complete. As sleep began to claim them, Eliza murmured one last thing, the fire still burning, stronger than ever. Thomas knew she wasn't talking about the hearth, which had burned low. She meant the fire between them, the passion that had survived everything Jesse Malone and fate itself had thrown at them. It would continue burning, he knew, through whatever seasons lay ahead. The Double M Ranch stood strong against the night, no longer a monument to one man's lonely ambition, but a home filled with love and promise. In the barn, horses dozed peacefully. In the garden, rain nourished plants that would feed them through winter. And in the house, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds held tight, their love a beacon in the darkness. Spring had come to Wyoming territory, bringing with it new life, new hope, and the proof that sometimes the coldest winters produce the most beautiful springs. The rancher had wanted warmth on his bed, but he'd found so much more, a love that burned stronger than fire, bright enough to light the way through any darkness, warm enough to thaw the deepest freeze. Their story would continue through summer harvests and autumn plenty, through winter storms and spring renewals. There would be other challenges, other joys, other quiet moments on the porch watching sunsets paint the sky. But tonight, as rain washed the world clean and prepared it for tomorrow's growth, Thomas and Eliza McGraw had everything they needed each other, their land, and a love that had been tested in fire and emerged stronger than steel. The Wild West had tried to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something unbreakable. And in that, there was not just warmth, but the kind of heat that could sustain a lifetime. Thank you so much for listening to this story, dear listeners. I hope these characters and their journey touched your heart as much as they touched mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts about Thomas and Eliza's story. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Night. Give this video a like. And don't forget to hit that hype button so more people can discover these stories of love, courage, and redemption in the American frontier. Until next time, partners.